Hey,
Hey,
Mark, how are you?
good. How are you?
Good, thank you.
Was anybody else at that T-Mobile fireside chat just now?
Yeah, I was.
It's really
Pretty
good.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it worth watching the video?
Yeah, definitely. I would watch the recording.
Cool.
The market
will
isn't
do that.
standing still. That's what I took away from it.
Okay, I think we are at time and have enough of a quorum to get things going here. I think most folks that are here now were involved in the previous working group. This one is going to largely be an extension of the work that was previously done. My take on the sort of current state is like both as a former customer and user and as in the position that I'm at GitLab now. I find the architecture blueprints to be like one of the best forms of documentation that we produce. What I really like about it, is that you can get pretty much all the context you need to understand what's going on at a high level in a single document. Granted, those documents aren't super consistent between different blueprints in their current state, but I think it's much easier to parse the information that's in blueprints than it is to parse all the information that can exist in a hierarchical set of epics plus all the comments and discussion. Did you want to follow up with your comments, Philip?
Yeah, thank you. I tend to disagree with that, especially with the way we are working GitLab, the workflows and everything. Blueprint seems to me like we are replicating a lot of features that we already have, a lot of workflows. I'd rather have all the architecture decisions in merge request instead of a doc that will just lie somewhere. A good example of that is the blueprint.
I think you
believe you went on mute accidentally.
Yeah,
I muted accidentally. Sorry for that. That's a good example, and I'm going to make that bigger for you. We have some blueprints in the architecture doc of GitLab, and it's really hard to understand what's the status of this. If this is ongoing, if this is done, if that reflects anything that has been produced already. I really struggle with that, honestly. And if you take a look at the page that we have for architecture, and that's the page that we actually share with customers, we don't have a link with these blueprints, and we end up with these kind of very high-level diagrams or very, very, very detailed diagrams like this one, which is honestly awful. And I don't see the point of having blueprints on the side of this.
Yes.
Does it mean that it's about a blueprint that it's not well written, or about a process perhaps? Because if you open the blueprint for CI data decay, you can see that there's a timeline in that blueprint, and you can probably understand what's the current state of it at this moment, because we keep it updated. And there are no large diagrams because it's not very readable. So does it mean that the process is flawed, or just the way we are writing some blueprints and not following them template or guidelines of what you should put in there?
Yeah, and I also think that like Zhao's right that the blueprints are intended to be more like architecture design records. And I think if we put like blueprints are only going to be more difficult to produce if we require that you specify both the entire state of point A where we are and the desired state of point B in every single document, right? Like that's, I don't think, so I think that architecture blueprints is a bit of a misnomer because it's not like most of the time it's going to result in architecture changes, but I don't think that that is necessarily the case. And so I want to make sure that like we're all on the same page in terms of like what a blueprint is. To me, a blueprint is like how we're going from current state to proposed state, but that doesn't have to involve architecture changes necessarily. It can just be a very complicated feature that has a lot of combines multiple components within the system, right? So I want to make sure we're not, I don't think we should be trying to solve the keeping the architecture diagrams up to date in the scope of this working group or like this process. I think you should be able to update the architecture diagrams based on the contents of these blueprints, right? Like there should be enough definition in the blueprints to know what the implications are to the architecture, but like, yeah, I don't think we should be trying to document that every time.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I used to think about blueprints as a map. I still think that a blueprint is actually a map of how to get from point A to point B. Now I think about blueprints more like a description of a technical vision so that people execute on that vision know where are we going actually and how to get there. So of course, as we move forward, because shipping complex architectural changes is an evolutionary process, we learn something after every step, and as we learn something new, we can get back to a blueprint, document new insights, adjust our trajectory, and in that regard, it's ADR, right? Architecture changes, decisions, records, something like that. But overall, the blueprint is actually a technical map of getting from point A to point B, to me.
So Grzegorz, just to kind of clarify a bit, do you see them as like a point in time, or do you see them as a evolving document over like an extended period? Like, because I tend to think of them as sort of a more point in time, like we're here, these are the challenges, and this is where we're going, but not sort of like a document that's necessarily evolving over years, or even like multiple quarters, perhaps.
So that's a good question, and I guess that it depends on who maintains a blueprint, and there are some, like, there is no consistency in how we are doing that. I personally like to keep my blueprint updated so that it doesn't matter when I'm actually reading that. If I'm reading that right now, it should still provide me some valuable insights, should explain why we are doing something. And sometimes it requires me to update it on a regular basis. Sometimes I can actually skip updating that if there is nothing new to put in there. But what is important for me, that whenever someone opens the document, whenever it happens, they should not be confused by what is in there. It should explain something to the people reading this blueprint. And I'm following the principle of the least surprise here, that when I'm reading a blueprint or someone does it, it should not be confusing to them what is in there. Does it make sense?
Yeah, so just on that, one of the things that I've been trying to encourage just in the dedicated team with the blueprints that we're putting together is it actually starts with a scope definition, and then kind of, as long as those things are still in play, then maybe the document should be up, kept up to date. But then at some point, you're going to kind of move on and move past the scope that you originally defined in. And then at that point, it becomes kind of a frozen document that no longer changes, because your scope is not, you've kind of moved on. And I think having that definition at the top to say, these are the problems that we're solving. And then almost more importantly, these are the problems that we're not solving. and then leaving those for like a future blueprint and not trying to keep updating. And then when people ask, why did you make this decision? You can point them to that and they can read through and see what's in scope and what's not. So I think scope is quite tied to that, just on that point.
Yeah, I absolutely agree that that's how we should structure these things. Like we should almost bias towards creating subsequent blueprints over updating an existing blueprint. I think once, like, and this goes back to what Philip was saying, like we really need to make it clear what the status of a given blueprint is. And I think it would be good to define what those are, because I think it's perfectly reasonable for a decision to be made and a blueprint produced, but that blueprint is effectively backlogged because we don't plan to implement it right now. And then like once some certain criteria is met, we can consider that blueprint implementable and then finally implemented, right? And then you wouldn't expect really, I mean, you would expect some changes perhaps as it's being implemented, but like once it is implemented, we should consider it a static document.
So if I may, I think talking about blueprints or whatever we want to name this, I think first we need to figure out who is the audience for this. The audience for blueprints was product managers and engineers to say, we need to build this, and then this is how we think we should do it. If that's what we're talking about, it doesn't matter to me what we call them, as long as we keep in mind who the audience was. The blueprints are published in docs because, well, there's a long list of reasons why they ended up there. But the audience was really more internal. Now, we're transparent, so we are okay sharing this with the world, but this was really, blueprints were intended to be able to, for very complex problems, to have a single place where people could go look at this document and say, we have this problem, we think we're gonna solve it this way, and then we get a bunch of managers involved so that we can staff this thing and prioritize it. Is that still the intent of what we're discussing, or are we discussing something else? Because I think Philip is talking about, the thing he showed us, to me, is something completely different, which is, here is GitLab and here is what it looks like. And that's not what this is about. Whereas these are very specific problem-centric documents and how we solve them. And you can see some recent ones like functional decomposition or the partitioning ones, which is, we have a scaling problem, here's some data around it, and here's how we're proposing to solve it. And then we need to build staffing around them. I think the current process, and I noted that a little bit lower, is when we created this process, engineering allocation didn't even exist yet. We were still going through what we called infra dev at the time. So the thing that we intended to do was to attach blueprints to engineering allocation and now the new prioritization model that we're using. Because I think the production of the technical solution is something we've gotten really good at, and blueprints have actually done okay in that regard. We can change that, but they've done okay. What we're recently meeting with resistance is, hey, we have a problem, we have a solution. How do we put this in the machine so that we get staff around it? And in some cases, we've done it almost as a one-off, right? For functional decomposition, we put a team together because we really needed to get that solved. And I think the challenge now is, how do you go from, I have a blueprint, to there is a group of people working on it. Is that the problem we're trying to solve versus what blueprints are?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the most desirable outcome of any reforms to this process should be that there's a clear path towards identifying the problem, documenting the proposed solution, and then like getting that into the work stream so that it gets implemented. I've been talking to some folks on this call already about this. I'm not sure like what needs to come first, whether we need the organization to consolidate around one process that defines the roadmap and like the work that needs to be done, or if we can like continue to iterate on the process that we have and expect that product can continue to have their separate process, but engineering's process somehow gets merged into the work stream, right? I mean, I think for a lot of reasons it would be preferable for everyone to consolidate on one process, and as we expand, what I think we ought to be doing is expanding the scope of the types of things that we expect blueprints to be produced for, because in my view, like any non-trivial enhancement probably ought to be a blueprint, right? Like when you have really major features, like I think the CI template catalog is a good example. I think it's worth it to have robust documentation and like a clear plan for what it looks like to implement those features. And so I would expect project managers to participate in this process, just like engineers would. To me, that makes sense. I don't know if that's the first step we should take, but that's the direction I'd like to see us go.
Just on that point, Marshall, like we spoke about this the other day, and you know, often in the change blog post, there'll be, you know, a bunch of changes, and then if you dig down deep enough, it'll take you to an issue where that change was discussed, and it will be an issue with like 1,000 notes on it, and it's often really difficult to kind of read that and then understand sort of the what was going on and how people were describing it, because it's just so big at this point, and having something a little bit more condensed into like a blueprint, you know, instead of pointing at that issue, we point at the blueprint, and then people might be able to get a better idea of kind of what the final decision was, rather than this issue, which is quite dynamic and changes over time.
Yeah, and even higher level than that, I think like the direction pages that product maintains, right? They're maintained to various degrees across different stages, right? There's also like no consistent formatting across those direction pages, and it's just a lot of prose content that's with links to epics and issues, right? But it's really difficult to get a concrete picture of what our 3, 6, 12-month roadmap is on the product side of the organization. I mean, I think like our architecture blueprints do a good job of documenting what that looks like from engineering's perspective, and I think that's because they're in a format that's sort of geared towards that purpose. So I think there's opportunity there as well. Did you want to voice the points you're making in B1 there, Eric? I think you're muted.
Oh, sorry, thanks. So you make in BI, you make a statement about how we have a separate product roadmap and technical engineering roadmap. And as long as they're separate, the former is always going to win. I agree the former has won historically, but I would sort of attribute this to something different. I don't think we have a traditional product roadmap. Like you hinted, it's sort of very fragmented. A lot of this was in PM's heads and whatnot. So it was near impossible for us to like reflect like, oh, this is what's coming. This is what we need to build. So let's build a more scalable CI architecture or whatever it was going to be to accommodate that. We were always reactive. We're always downstream. We're always sort of like iterating, and we obviously iterate ourselves into some holes. And then I think we proved we can do the work to get out of those holes, especially over the last 9 months. But we need to roll forward to a better model. So, and Chad, like you mentioned previous, like yes, so like we're about to launch a new prioritization model called cross-functional prioritization. The next prioritization working group is working on that, but we should absolutely have the room in that model to do architectural work. It won't be just go back to features until something breaks, and then we'll fix everything and mop up after ourselves. So it's intended to be a very balanced model of product, engineering, security, design, customer concerns, everything. And there's a discussion on that. I don't know if we have time to go into that. But the number 2, I think, is important, which is like your statement in BI is really the closest in this doc I see to like a problem statement here for like this working group, of which this is the first instance. What do we agree is the problem to be solved here? and then we should start solutioning. And we're sort of dancing around that, but I think that's the most important thing to spend time on first.
I think that's a really good point. And I think to me, that seems like the crux of this and the SIGs discussion as well. Like there's not a good forum to ensure allocation for these large scale, long-term efforts that we think we need to do as the company and the product grows that we maybe haven't had the need to do in the past. And like the way I understood the next prioritization is that, okay, you're going to carve out within a group or, you know, feature some allocation for technical debt, but this is that as well as the current working groups, as well as I think architectural blueprints are more like historically time-bounded and specific scope things, not large-scale efforts that could span the entire product for a long time and would need dedicated engineering effort allocated for a long time.
Yeah, so the closest thing we have to a forum today is the Tuesday engineering allocation meeting. So that's where we review metrics for the health of the systems, and that's where we track projects that are going on. But this was very much like an emergency measure, right? So we've been doing this for a while. This would be the place to propose things that you want to do, whether it's partition a table or decompose some other functional area of the database going forward. But it's sort of a prototype, right? And that's what we're looking to kind of formalize with cross-functional prioritization. But it's going to take a while. We're breaking old habits, and we're going to have to build up new habits. And it's not going to happen with the launch of a handbook page or because we named a process or something like that. We're going to have to kind of retrain ourselves. And you know, to be fair to what I said above, like, you know, I say this, like, you know, the PM monopoly on decision-making power, like that is true. But like the other reason that didn't work is because engineering the whole time was supposed to be saying like, hey, this is broken, let's fix it. We got tired of raising our hand and just stopped doing that, right? So that's the way it intended to work. It didn't work, but like it's both sides that sort of fell apart. So I'm not pinning that solely on PM. PM is correct to say like, hey, I didn't know this was breaking. It's like, yeah, you're not close to the problem, you know? So it just reinforces the need to kind of like change that whole structure of incentives and process and whatnot.
Yeah, and I also think like I do think that like the separate product and technical roadmaps is very core to what we need to solve here. But like there's a bunch of like other problems that I think that creates. One of which is that I think it's just difficult for engineers to track what's happening throughout the organization, right? And so like there's an opportunity cost associated with that where we tend to build divergent solutions rather than convergent solutions, because for any given thing that a product wants to build, you're maybe getting like two engineer eyes, two sets of eyes on that before work gets started, right? And those eyes are coming from the same product group that the proposal is initiated from, right? So when you've got people working on similar functionality, or like how we're going to structure object storage, or like general purpose solutions for artifact storage of any kind, like there's never an opportunity to get feedback from multiple parts of the organization and then build that core platform element that would help support all of those use cases. So it's like communication, I think, is a big aspect to this.
Yeah, I mean, and I think to be realistic though, like this unifying the roadmaps and stuff like that, like just knowing where PM is, what they're working on, they're rebuilding, they're hiring, like we're not going to solve this unified roadmap problem in the near term. But I think there is a very good opportunity now that I think this group should focus on, which is we're going to launch this new process, cross-functional prioritization. How do we best make sure that like we're doing architecture, like we're slotting into that we're doing architecture work as part of that new process? Like that's an opportunity that's right in front of ourselves. It's mostly within our sphere of control versus like changing how product does roadmaps is not in our control, and they're working on other stuff, trust me, right now. And I think that would be the highest impact thing we could work on. So if the problem statement were, you know, make sure we're doing future unknown architectural changes akin to functional decomposition of CI, which we just completed, at or ahead of when they're needed, using the cross-functional prioritization group. Like that's a problem statement that I think we could start to debate and roll around in and stuff.
Yeah, I agree that, I mean, a lot of the stuff that has happened architecturally is because people are pushing and prodding and talking, and we should institutionalize that. And this was frankly an attempt to do that, right? Although it was more geared towards making sure that any engineer who had an idea or saw a problem, could actually get organization-wide visibility for these problems. But the thing that my conclusion about the current process is that it's not scalable. And it's not scalable because it was always tied to Stan, to me, to draggers, to very specific people. And so now that this prioritization framework is coming up, we need to figure out, how do you take these artifacts that we're producing today that we can iterate and improve by all means, but how do we make sure that they get into that, into that machine and get prioritized accordingly, as opposed to who makes the most noise about this thing that's coming?
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that we do have some recent examples about the struggles with the workflow. For example, the CI partitioning, right? We have a blueprint, we have a CI scaling, a CI data decay blueprint written, approved, and everyone says that we should probably do that. But we've been talking for more than 3 or 4 months. We had numerous meetings with Sam Goldstein, with Camille, with Chun about how to actually implement that, and we still don't know yet. It's taking a lot of time to figure it out, how to get things like that implemented, how to even get started with them. And that's definitely part of the problem that perhaps we'll be able to solve here.
You mean trouble getting engineering effort allocated? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like there's a clear path forward, just not the allocation.
And
Yeah, so
can somebody describe to me, like somebody who's gone through the process firsthand, what the relationship with product is at the very end? Because my understanding is that in order for a blueprint to get merged, there has to be some buy-in from product, but it seems like it's an informal commitment nevertheless. So what does that interaction with the PM look like?
So from my experience, it's finding an EM who is going to be a DRI from the product group side, and explaining to them what the blueprint is about. Eventually, they agree that it's a good idea, but then there is always some kind of miscommunication about the extent of the effort, the amount of people we would need to involve to get it implemented. And then we usually collide with the reality where we are usually unable to get enough time from engineers as they are working on other important priorities. And yeah, and then nothing happens for a couple of months. And this is what has happened with the GraphQL blueprint. We got it merged more than a year ago, I think 18 or 20 months ago. And we could never actually do anything about that GraphQL blueprint. And it was mostly observability on the infrastructure side. We have been unable to ship anything because we couldn't find people who could actually work on that in the entire organization.
Right. So what's missing is the institutional lever that for any given blueprint proposal, whatever it is, that there is sort of an official decision made of, no, we're not going to work on this, or yes, we're going to work on this. Right now, some things just sort of wither and fade into the background, like GraphQL. And so it is that mechanism, to Eric's point. We're building this new prioritization model. We need to figure out what is the linkage between the current process with whatever changes we end up making to it. But at the end of the day, we can, we've been writing really good blueprints. It's just getting the commitment from product. And it usually happens in ways in which if we make enough noise about something or show enough danger about something. Functional decomposition is a great example of that. It's, if we don't do this, the database will run into a wall and we can, kiss this goodbye. That was sort of clear and present danger. And so people signed on to it. We need a way that it pushes that danger further into the future, but that's always a harder case to make, right? But, well, if we don't do this in 18 months, things will go sideways. So latching into this prioritization model is, I think, the way in which we make the next very significant iteration to get these engineering-led initiatives to be given a fair view and to be evaluated and to be staffed and to be moved forward and to be slotted into the priorities. Because at the end of the day, there's a limited number of engineers. Like, we'd like to go boil the oceans, but
yeah, I mean, I think CI decomposition is an interesting case too, because like it's actually for a lot of reasons, some of which you mentioned, it's sort of like an ideal case, right? Because it is very urgent, right? If we don't solve it, we fall over. But also, like, it really was within scope of like one particular product stage, right? Like it's pretty much discretely the responsibility of Verify to solve that problem. I think when we look to other examples like rate limiting and the GraphQL blueprint, that's even harder,
Object
right?
storage.
Because it's
Object storage.
object storage, because it's there's not even a team that we can
actually
put
functional decomposition, we're recording this, so I'll be nice about it. We got functional decomposition scheduled because it was proposed as a step to pods.
right.
So it's not like we scare people enough with the database, is because pods are in our future. We said, this is the way to get there. Whether we shard or we pod, functional decomposition buys us some runway and it allows us to start moving things in certain ways. So we scored that one, which was super critical, but because we sort of piggyback on this pods ideal of where we want to go. And it shouldn't be that way, right? It should be in a more institutionalized, systematic way of saying, look, engineering is telling you that in 18 months, we really need to finish this so that we are sort of, and is it that we're not good at selling those predictions? I don't know. I mean, for the most part, it comes down to pushing and prodding in different places and convincing enough people to get that unwedged and moving forward.
So about the blueprints, I always like receive them as a snapshot of like the intent of what we want to do, and maybe for what reasons. And like one of the examples, like composable code base, there is like a blueprint. Whether we do it or not, I think it's like yet to define. But I also kind of perceive that like product prioritization is rather like a local problem or like a local optimization, where delivery of the blueprint, if we commit to that, it's like a global problem because of the severity and overlap and requirement from many functions. So for example, Marshall, you mentioned the composition, like Verify alone would not do the composition because of severe implications required, or like severe amount of people required from many functions. So I think like probably, at least from my perspective, like product prioritization happens locally, where blueprint prioritization needs to happen globally across organization because it has severe implications to the future development of the application. And like partitioning is yet another example. It's gonna have severe implications how we partition tables. It's like maybe initially CI, but it's like really like a practice that we need to apply moving forward. GraphQL, maybe it's like a local problem. Composable code base is definitely like a global problem. And I think like time decay for the CI is like maybe defined as a local problem, but this is like a general problem description of how we want to approach the data retention, which is becoming more and more problem of GitLab outside of the CI as well.
Yeah, that I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, and I think like the way the work was actually done in the decomposition case was that we created sort of like a pseudo group under platform scalability, right? So like, I don't know. I think if we took that approach in all such cases, it could result in a lot of churn with a bunch of people changing managers all the time, right? Particularly if the efforts are like slightly less long-lived than that one in particular. Like I can imagine us making a lot of headway on like the GraphQL blueprint, for example, in far less than a year's time, right? Like maybe like 3, at the most 6 months. And I think we would get a lot of pushback from product if we tried to change management structures in order to execute on that stuff.
I think the things you're talking about are the things that don't have a clear owner, right? And that has traditionally been a problem here. If you see a database team in development, it's because we said this thing is so important and it consumes so many people that we have to have a team that is dedicated to this. But those have been, in our history, exceptions rather than the rule, because there is this long collection of things, GraphQL is one of them, that they don't belong in a stage, right? And there has been discussions of, do you have this sort of platform group in development as well? Like we did that in infrastructure because at the time, there was no one else who could devote cycles to fixing scalability problems with Sidekick, with Redis. And so we created the scalability team inside infrastructure. Andrew was leading the charge with that. And he was early on, he was a part of that team. That team is now 2 teams, right? So we seem to be doing that in infra, but that hasn't caught on in development, except for some notable examples like memory and database, right? And so there are a lot of orphan things out there that are very foundational under the surface that no one really sees, right? But because they don't belong to a stage, they don't even have a PM assigned to them.
Right.
And you know, we've been kicking this on and off in like, there was a proposal once that the last person that touches this part of the code base owns that. And I'm like, that's a horrible idea.
Right.
You don't want to do that. Like, you need people thinking about these problems. So I think we need to figure out exactly which is the problem we're attacking, which is from this conversation, it sounds like the frustration around the call is, I have this thing, how do I get it implemented? Because I know it has to be implemented. And then focus on how we make that happen. Because at the end of the day, that is the thing, that is the thing that keeps me busy every day. Just pushing buttons on people's keypads to say that needs attention and that needs attention and that needs attention. And sometimes that happens successfully. It's also very part of the culture, right? Everybody can contribute, and so I think it's part of a growing pains. We're a much bigger company, so you can now have hundreds of people proposing things, and how do you make sense of them? And at the end of the day, you still have to go through the filter of product, because they're the ones that are tasked with prioritizing and implementing and delivering, and sort of arranging people in engineering and development and infra to be able to deliver these things. Infra is sort of an exception because we're tasked with infrastructure and we're tasked with low-level stuff. But still, whenever there's a Postgres upgrade, you need to go reach out into development to say, hey, is Postgres 13 something we can use? But for that specific use case, there is a database team. So it sounds more and more like we're looking for a group of people that can take over these foundational things. And so we're either building a case for 1, 2, or N teams in development that can be platform specific and not working on features, but working on these things. Or that gets grown into more scalability and infrastructure, or we somehow find the magic formula to be able to get these things across in this prioritization model that is being developed.
Jerry, like just one sort of point on that. Like there was a proposal a while ago where there was a discussion around like engineering self-allocated time. I forgot what it was called, and how much time
Right.
you know, different engineers are basically basically figuring out what to do. And there seems to be some sort of like connection between this and that, because like a lot of this stuff is stuff that falls through the cracks with product, but is very important to engineers. And like perhaps if there was more of a kind of understanding about self-directed time and you know, putting together these proposals, engineering could kind of pick up some of that more.
Yeah,
I think
that's NMR.
I'm sorry. So I think that self-directed time will not solve that, because from my experience,
No, it's a part of it, but yeah.
I think that the key component of getting complex architectural changes done is focus. And if we want to get them done, we need to make sure that engineers working on a given problem can focus 100% on that. And with self-directed time, it clearly won't be possible.
Yeah, that's NMR Eric put together, and like many other things, the one of the questions was funding. How do we justify that we swipe 20% of, on average, of time for every engineer to go do whatever they want? And funding was sort of one of the things that I don't think the MR was closed. I think it was just sort of frozen for a while until we could figure out what it actually looked like. But I agree that it wouldn't solve this problem, right? We have managed to get things through almost through people's heroic efforts, right? Like think about the ton of stuff you've done in the last 2 years, which has been, you've seen a problem and you've been able to go focus on it and convince people we need to work on it. But it shouldn't be like that. It shouldn't be you having to jump on a table, kicking and screaming that this is an issue. It should be this is an issue, and we put it in this prioritization machine, and it comes up with a number of engineers and the amount of time that they're working. And in product's defense, that, you know, where we were 2 years ago or 4 years ago to where we are today is leaps and bounds. Like we've made forward progress, and more product is more and more aware of these things. I mentioned that Fabian added scalability and availability as a line item in their budgeting stuff. That's huge. I mean, it's a one-liner, but that is huge because now PMs have to sort of figure out, oh, I'm not just delivering this because I'm going to put this thing on GitLab.com and it's got to go scale. And so I need to, the problem is there isn't a specific number associated with that line item. So, you know, organizationally and institutionally, we need to, you know, scalability is a forever task.
Yeah. Well,
and availability is a forever task.
And I think it's beneficial to the organization for those problems to be distributed, right? Like I think there's significant risk in sort of creating like a platform A team, right? That runs around and solves every scalability issue or like every sort of cross-functional effort, because you're going to staff that with a bunch of high context people, and then that context is going to continue to get siloed in that team over time. So like I would lean towards something that allows us to, much like engineering allocations used to be, where we can create some like maybe long-lived, but maybe short-lived, depending on the use case, structure, pull engineers from a bunch of different areas, solve the problem, and then, but like their reporting structure doesn't change. But I mean, I don't know.
Well,
like
there are various cases to be made for that, right? So for instance, take the Camille, and the folks that develop functional decomposition. They just solve a very difficult problem. And do we take the next problem and give it to them? Or do we reshape that group and send those people who have just now gotten a ton of very advanced experience and sprinkle them around the organization so they can raise the level of the organization? And this is kind of a management question that needs to be answered in terms of, to avoid that the thing you're talking about, which is, okay, only these people are solving these really hardcore low-level problems, but that means that knowledge isn't really permeating through the org. Or do you have this team that it's more of a rotating door of, hey, we're going to solve the next big problem, let's shift 50% of the team around just to, and I don't have a good answer whether, like, I can see both things are good. Like, this team now works really well together, right? They've delivered functional decomposition and they figure out how they cycle. So if you start shifting people around, then that breaks that rhythm. But at the same time, you're also avoiding the keeping them all under the same sort of box. And but I think these are more academic things. At the end of the day, is how do we justify funding to product for them to allocate people to solve these problems?
Mm-hmm.
Like, it's all the academic stuff that we're talking about, it all makes sense. Like, I think from an ideas point of view, this all makes sense. But we always, our wall is funding for solving this problem. And that's the wall we need to break. And again, I think product has come a long way in helping us think about scalability as a problem that needs to be solved. But there are more turns to that vault that we need to make.
And I think it's exacerbated by the fact that like in many cases, you almost need a dedicated resource to even fully uncover the problem and even begin to come up with solutions, right? So like, there's a trust relationship that needs to exist as well, where like somebody can say, hey, this is going to become a problem, and product is immediately willing to give that person the space to evaluate that, right? That's
where the current workflow came from, right?
Yeah.
To be able to say, okay, I'm engineer so-and-so, and I see this, and I'm gonna yell, but no one's gonna listen. So let's put this thing together so that we drag, some senior technical people into this, and we drag some SMEs into this, and we drag some management into this, and we drag product into this. What we haven't been able to do is to turn that into something that delivers something for sure, right? Like in some blueprints, we don't even have an answer. We've gone through the process, we've put the blueprint together, that is the artifact that gets produced, but there's no decision being made. And so we sort of go back to, how do we plug in whatever it is that we have, blueprints, epics, whatever it is, into making sure that we get a yeah or nay, not silence on the line, which is what GraphQL has gotten over the last 2 years. No one has said we should never do this. No one has said we will not do this. It's just sort of it gets mothballed, and no one talks about it. And then one day there will be a GraphQL event, and then we will go work we will all go work on it. So that's it. I think. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'm pretty surprised that we don't have a group owning GraphQL yet, given how many requests it produces. But this is really a side note, and the lack of the observability around it. But
I looked at it the other day, and it was pretty terrifying how much of our fleet is running that now. Sorry to interrupt.
But I think we agree about the GraphQL being a smoking gun to fire at very unexpected moment. But this is a side note. But the other note, maybe kind of approaching that from the academia point of view. Maybe we just have architecture steering committee that we kind of review blueprints and say, okay, GraphQL, it's like from the group, I don't know, 5-10 people, whoever is there, we present it to Eric. It always helped to have Eric or Sid we like putting a stamp on that this is something that we want to do. And this kind of raises the importance of these items, because I think like the GraphQL example shows that it's really hard to prioritize. It's really hard to reason that this is gonna be a problem. It's more like, I guess, like a wisdom of the few people. And maybe company trust this wisdom of these few people that it's really something that we should do ahead of that time.
So I thought about that. The reason why we don't have the council is that Sid and Eric were very vocal about not willing to have a council and committee of architects. And the way I try to approach this problem of having like more like a group of people elevating the importance of something, I wanted to add the section of recommenders to a blueprint so that we have a few names of people that are supporting given initiative. We have them documented in the blueprints, what should make it easy to understand that those people believe that it's important to resolve that. That being said, I think that basically it's quite surprising that very often we do have product on the same page. Product believes that this is something that we should do. It's just they are saying that we don't have capacity to do that. And recently, in case of CI partitioning, we even had an investment case with like a case for hiring 5 additional people, but it won't solve that problem because we will hire them probably like throughout the year. Those new people won't be able to work together. They won't have domain knowledge. And so yeah, talking about many things at once.
Committees or no committees, it's whoever is holding the pen. And in our case, the pen is being held by product. So, for me, that means building relationships with product so that when people bring things up, I can sort of go back to the folks in product that I talk to regularly to say, we need to get this in the roadmap somewhere. We need to get cycles to it. But even when I get those people to say yes, when they need to sign the check, they may go like, well, I have 5 other things competing for this. So sorry, your stuff is just not going to happen unless there is an event, right? And so database was an easy one because we're super sensitive to the database because it's bitten us so many times that we just instinctively respond to it. And we were willing to fund a permanent team around the database. So even if you put together a committee with the 10 most senior ranking technical people in engineering, none of us carry that pen. Only product carries that pen. And I think to Eric's point, finding out how we exert pressure through that model is what's going to get us the voice that we need to be able to get things prioritized. Because right now it's really built upon personal relationships as opposed to being a systematic thing.
Yeah, and I'm gonna have to drop here shortly as well, but I think the only real opportunity I see with the next hooking into the next prioritization stuff, and maybe we're already too late on this because the idea is that product is required to allocate 30% time to maintenance, right? But they can themselves still identify what is maintenance within their particular stage. Like we could have used this as an opportunity to just straight up allocate 30% of the prioritization to engineering, right? And then we could have coordinated within engineering, like what that stuff looks like. So maybe there's still an opportunity to do that where we, like, rather than taking the approach that we're currently headed down, which is labeling issues that are related to maintenance as maintenance, maybe we say that everything that we're considering maintenance has to go through this enhancement proposal or blueprint process, and engineering is going to make the decisions for which of those items are priority.
I think that's definitely a proposal that we can bring to Eric and say, can you negotiate this with product for us to be the ones that own that 30%? in a structured way, right? So we have this process, and it's not like we just show up to the party and say, hey, let's go do this. As product, what would it take? What do you need from us to be able to, for us to move those prioritization levers within this model?
Yeah.
For that 30%.
Because I would just, I mean, 30% is so significant. I would just hate to see that squandered on like, we need a like minor version of our jQuery dependency upgraded, right? Like, yeah, that stuff has to happen too, but when there's like such significant maintenance that needs to be done, having an individual product stage make the decision that they want to spend their time on upgrading library dependencies instead of working on like architectural changes doesn't seem good.
I think the front end teams might disagree on that, but
I should have picked something that was less controversial. Yeah,
I've had a few discussions about what maintenance actually is, and I think that maintenance, what we think, or like what many people at GitHub think what maintenance is that it's some kind of a backlog of issues that you can burn, and you can pick an issue from the top, resolve that, and just proceed until you have nothing in the backlog. And this is perhaps like 10% of maintenance. The 90% of maintenance, in my opinion, is actually a technical vision that is documented in an enhancement proposal or the architectural evolution blueprint. And then issues are being created proactively based on the vision. And that's what maintenance actually is. You can't have like a complete roadmap for a maintenance for the next 5 years. The maintenance is a maintenance is a process. Maintenance is not a collection of issues that you can distribute amongst teams and just get them assigned.
All right. Well, I think we've gone sufficiently over time for this week. I'll see you all next week.